Hello and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today I'm joined by Tim Hillier and Gavin Dingwall, who are the authors of Criminal Justice and the Pursuit of Truth. We discuss their books and their book and some wider issues in the criminal justice system, and we just have a discussion basically concerning issues in criminal justice. Their book looks to bridge the gap between what people expect from the criminal justice system and what the system can legitimately deliver itself. I hope you enjoy the show. Enjoy.
Hi, Gavin and Tim. Thanks for joining us this morning. And we're here to talk about your book, Criminal Justice and the Pursuit of Truth. So my first question is, what inspired this book?
I think the book sort of originated. We'd written a book jointly on sort of criminal justice and blame and the place of blame within the sort of wider society and the way that impacted on criminal justice. And we were conscious of the fact that, you know, in recent years, there'd been a huge increase in the number of criminal offences. And we felt that there was this sort of idea that if anything goes wrong, then the best answer from the government, from politicians, was to criminalise it and go ahead with a trial. And it was really out of that, I think, that Gavin and I had sort of discussions about it, and we'd finished the book, and what do we do next? And when we started to get this sort of idea of, well, the next sort of logical step of once you've identified someone to blame, once you've sort of got the scapegoat, as it were, you've then got to construct the case. And the sort of the popular view of the criminal trial is very much a pursuit of truth, and we find the scapegoat, we conduct a fair trial, and we come with the truth at the end of it. The more we thought about it, the more we thought, well, actually that's not quite how it works in reality. There's lots of sort of trips and traps along the way. There are, sort of the formal rules of evidence that say some bits that might help you discover the truth, you specifically exclude because it's unfair. And it's this sort of mix, really, of criminal justice, partly as sort of a game with very strict rules, but partly is this, and sometimes presented as this very, scientific pursuit of truth. So that was really the basis.
And I suppose there were sort of two things, weren't there, Tim? I mean, first of all, the criminal justice system sort of rests on this idea that there is such a thing as truth, and that a rigorous process actually will arrive at it. And that was one of our concerns, that perhaps an objective truth doesn't exist or is very hard to agree upon. And then the other thing, as Tim was saying, was this idea that, well, there are things which might be very probative, which we still on other grounds would want not to use as evidence. So classic example of that would be perhaps a search which yields incriminating evidence, but which was totally unlawful. And it poses a really stark issue of policy. That do you use that evidence to convict someone who's guilty of an offence, or do you say, well, no, if we allow that, we're just giving carte blanche to law enforcement agencies to ignore the rules which are there for a reason?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think maybe the wider public aren't necessarily aware of about the idea that stuff can be excluded. And I think from a wider perspective, the ITV drama, A Confession, have you seen that? About the man. There was a murder in Swindon of a young girl, and the police actually they catch this man. They take him into the car. He shows them the body, and then, not under caution, he turns around to the officer and says, "Do you want another one?" And he takes them. It's a true story. He takes them to the sort of vague area of where a second lady was killed, and they look to charge him on that the original murder as well as this sort of second body as well. And then obviously the prosecution said, well, we can't, the evidence would be inadmissible. But from the point of view of the families who didn't feel like there was any form of justice because that admission is effectively ignored by the court process. I think it poses a very difficult problem. Is there an answer for a situation like that, where there is a clear confession, a clear admission? I mean, are we doing the right thing by excluding it for the protection of everybody else?
Well, I suppose one possible way of looking at this is we have a system which doesn't require confession evidence to be corroborated. And we certainly have psychological evidence that people have confessed to crimes that they haven't committed. And I know, Ed, that you did a criminal justice natter on this very issue.
Yes. Yeah.
And well, with the world leader who's looked at false confessions, so I won't in any way try and replicate that discussion. But I think we can take it as a fact that people have walked into police stations, have confessed to things that they have not done. So, in the absence of a requirement that we have to have corroborating evidence, we then have to ask, in what circumstances do we say that a confession isn't sufficiently robust, but it might be unreliable?
I think, yeah, and I think the other thing, I mean, that we look into in the book, it is this sort of the fallibility of memory as well, and that even where someone is, categorically, 100% sure that something happened, they can be mistaken. There can be all sorts of reasons why, obviously there's been sort of quite a lot of controversy over this sort of idea of false memory and false memory syndrome and all that, but there's still nonetheless is a body of scientific evidence that suggests that memory isn't something, it isn't just a video recording of what happened and you play it back again and again and it's the same each time, but in fact it can be influenced, and with mounting evidence of the way in which questions and interrogations are conducted can change the nature of the information you get. So it's that even where you've got something as straightforward as a confession, someone saying I did it, or do you want to find the other body, here they are, it's is it the truth, I think.
And I sort of ask my students at the start of every semester when we start criminal procedure and punishment, or what would be your driving goal? Do you want the truth, or do you want something that we can prove? Because I don't necessarily, the two, and obviously coming across in the book, those two things don't necessarily sit side by side very well. I mean, for you guys, what would be the sort of best approach for you? Because I don't think we can have both.
Yeah, I think that's a fair conclusion to draw. I think where Tim and I sort of came to at the end was what we need to do is we need to look at more general questions about what are the aims of the criminal justice system. And we tied it back really to conclusions we drew in the Blamestorming book, where, as Tim said at the start of this discussion, that the criminal justice system seems preoccupied with identifying an individual person that we can blame. And we posit this idea that perhaps if we were to look at a broader conception of truth, now this could be either on an individual level, where we start looking at factors which might explain why somebody offended. So that might point towards, say, a restorative justice approach. And Tim and I have also done some work where we've looked at truth commissions. And in fact, one of the early projects we worked on together looked at punishment in international criminal tribunals. And we just found that any standard justification for punishing someone, trying to rehabilitate someone or deter someone or come up with a proportionate penalty, they just kind of fell away one after the other, I think, when we looked at it in that context. So I think we were attracted to looking at how truth could emerge in another forum. So I suppose it's just this idea, Ed, of not necessarily going straight to the criminal justice system as the best forum for determining the truth. I don't know, Tim, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that is it. And I think it is part of I think certainly for me, I'm not speaking for Gavin necessarily, but I think it is with me a sort of a growing sort of almost dissatisfaction with criminal justice as being the sort of the main weapon, if you like, that what you've got, and I know there's sort of it fits in with the work on harm and social harm and all that sort of field of work, that you have basically, you have a criminal offence. There's a problem in society, something's gone wrong, and you need to solve that problem. And I'm not, increasingly less and less convinced that the criminal justice system does any good at all in relation to it. I think you've got the sort of the issues with prisons and punishment and the way in which that. Apologise for the dogs in the background.
Do you want me to take over for a second?
Yeah, I'll go on mute for a minute.
One of the great things with teaching with Tim, we co-teach Ed, and if we've got a 2-hour session, at some point I know there's going to be a dog fight in the background, which always livens things up just a little bit.
If I could return to Tim raised a point earlier, and it's in the sort of concluding chapter about the amount of criminal offences that we have now. And you say in the concluding chapter, over 35 years, we've moved to a more judgmental, less sympathetic, and more punitive society. And we talk about Tony Blair and his comments, you talk about Tony Blair and his comments when he was in the shadow cabinet. And it does seem to be that from that sort of mid-1990s, sort of time period, there has been just an explosion of criminal offences, that if there is a problem, let's criminalise it, we'll punish someone, and that will solve the issue. Yet the rates of recidivism points to the fact that doesn't work. I don't know if you've covered it somewhere previously or covered it in this book. I've not read the whole book, but what was the genesis of this sort of politicisation of criminal justice, in that we have the answers and we can keep you safe, so vote for us?
Okay, well, just to sort of quickly fill Tim in, Ed was posing this idea that we talk about since the mid-90s, there's been a real explosion in the number of criminal offences, and this seems to be the default position. And why has this occurred? I think the first thing is a political argument. And that was Tony Blair certainly felt that the Labour Party and parties on the left generally were vulnerable on questions of law and order. And we quote from a lengthy extract from the famous interview he gave with the New Statesman, where he came up with the immortal line. Apparently Gordon Brown claims credit for it. I've been tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, or tough on plagiarism, tough on the causes of plagiarism. So I think that was one of the first things, that there was a perceived view that Labour had to come up with they would say a more robust, we would say a more punitive response to crime for reasons of electoral credibility. I think the other thing was there were a succession of very hardline Home Secretaries who were quite happy to get into a sort of nuclear war against the Conservative Party in terms of sort of ratcheting up levels of punitiveness. And then I think, as Tim says, it becomes a default position, that move away from that becomes difficult.
I think also there's an element, and because I don't think it's just a UK thing, or I think there's also an element of, it's almost a sign of the weakness of politicians, that there's less and less they can deal with. If you think back, something like the fixing of interest rates in sort of controlling inflation, which used to be a government action, was handed over to the Bank of England. Other areas are handed over to experts. Criminal justice is one of those few areas where politicians, it's quite easy for politicians to act and to appear to be acting decisively. There's an issue here. We are pledged to reforming the law. Elect us and we'll change the law, and we'll punish the wrongdoers. And it's got that sort of simplicity. And I think that does it does mask the truth of what's going on in very many ways, I think.
I mean, a classic example is the recent increase in the maximum penalty for vandalising a statue. They've risen it to a very high level, but let's be honest, maxima are very, very seldom imposed when somebody commits a criminal offence, and no doubt the sentencing guidelines will, come in with a far lower recommended sentence. In fact, I may be wrong in this, but I'm pretty sure the relevant sentencing guideline already has a provision to deal with criminal damage if it wouldn't cover a statue, but it would certainly, I think, cover a memorial which had been damaged as an aggravating factor. So in a way, it's a classic example of something which we don't need, but which is, as Tim says, a very easy reaction.
Yeah. So sort of reactionary politics to the idea that the courts already have these powers, but we've maybe just dressed them up and finessed them in a different way to make it look like our politicians are doing something about it.
Yeah.
In terms of this idea, it seems to be our criminal justice system is centered on this idea of, you've done something wrong, and despite the aims of the Criminal Justice Act of various purposes of sentencing, I feel we focus very much on retribution. We have to harm you. We're going to harm you by placing you in prison. And if we are thinking that prison is the place where it's going to deter you from committing future crimes, the rates of reoffending suggest that that's not the case. And especially for those, I think it was between 7 and 11 previous offences, the rates of reoffending are much higher. The prison system seems to be in crisis. We read that a lot. And I mean, since I was studying law in the early 2000s, I had a question on the prison crisis. And crisis is the wrong word, because it's just constantly in a state of decay. And if we think about sort of overpopulation of the prison system and this desire to make more offences criminal and therefore more people can go to prison, how are we going to buck this trend or break this trend, imagining the desire was there to do so?
I think it is very difficult. I think there are. I suspect that there was a similar issue as people started to feel the sort of the bloody code and the number of capital offences that existed. There was, I imagine, a similar sort of discussion of people saying, how are we going to stop this? We must stop stringing so many people up. How do we do it? And the same with, transportation, I suppose, died out because, with American independence, and then sort of, it became limited. But this sort of thing of prisons, you're right, is a real issue, and it isn't solving a fundamental problem. I think it is by sort of getting the word out there, really, and trying to convince people. It's interesting you're saying about, sort of the focus on rehabilitation and to some extent deterrence. I'm always struck by when we teach, penology to third-year law undergraduates, that they invariably start out when you have the sort of initial discussions at the start of the course. That's very much, well, it's obvious you send people to prison. You have to. You're not going to let them get away with it. And it's very much, well, why do we send them to prison? And it's that mixture of rehabilitation and deterrence. If we didn't send them to prison, they'd be out doing it all the time. Well, are you out doing it all the time? Well, no, but and you go from there, really.
I think also there's a couple of things which are worth bearing in mind, just so we don't come across as total sort of gloom emergency. The first one is other countries have successfully reduced their prison populations. Yeah. So we do have international examples where this has happened and where there's not been huge explosions of crime as a consequence. The Netherlands is the one which is usually cited here. The other thing is and one of the things which I always think is perhaps not widely known is the rates of youth custody in England and Wales now. That's fallen massively in the last decade. And again, that I think shows that if there's a will, things can be done. Now, there are questions about, are these kids effectively being diverted out of the criminal justice system into another form of control? But I think what it shows is other countries have managed to successfully reduce adult prison populations, and we have managed to reduce the number of children in custody. So it can be done. The question then is the one as Tim raises, how do you get that will to do so?
In terms of the Netherlands dropping or reducing their prison population, what did they do to reduce that?
I can't say an awful lot because I wouldn't claim any expertise in comparative law. But I mean, effectively, the obvious ways to do it are, first of all, to make a whole load of offences. You remove the possibility of somebody being in prison. This has been mooted as an idea in England and Wales. There was a position paper put forward by Andrew Ashworth, which argued that perhaps you cannot use imprisonment for theft offences, which is a bold suggestion. The other thing which has happened in some jurisdictions, and I'm giving this sort of discussion, I'm taking part in it from Edinburgh, is you remove the possibility of imposing short prison sentences. And Scotland has tried this and believed it to be successful, and so have increased the sort of length of the minimum term, if you like.
I think that was the point I was going to, or is linked to the point I was going to make, is about, I think a lot of places where they've reduced the overall prison numbers, it has also been reducing sort of average prison length, average sentence length. And in fact, here in England and Wales, we've moved in the opposite direction, that, there's been a steady increase in average sentence length. I think there's a growing body of opinion that suggests that the sentencing guidelines have sort of added to that pressure, and sentencing judges at Crown Court and magistrates sort of conscious of the risk of being appealed are sort of cautious and increasing sentence length. And I mean, my fear, Gavin and I have had this discussion about the issue in relation to short sentences, is my fear is that unless you have this sort of acceptance that average sentence length needs to come down, abolishing short sentences or restricting short sentences will simply mean people get more than 12, those huge numbers that are getting sentences under 12 months at the moment will simply just get 15 months instead of and that won't solve it. It's really a shift in sort of thinking to sort of realize, actually, what are we, it's that back to those fundamental questions. Why are we sending people to prison? What's the point of it? What benefit does it give us as society?
And certainly the other thing is, if you talk to people who are sentencing, they often say at the people you're giving short sentences to, they're almost sentences of desperation. These are people who are often repeat property offenders. They've tried everything else, but they just keep reoffending. And from that point of view, perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised if the minute they come out of prison, they go back into the same pattern of offending, which I suppose suggests two things. It suggests, first of all, as Tim says, that it's a fairly sort of futile approach. But on the other, I suppose what it does is it shows that, well, some individuals are not going to respond to any particular type of sentence.
No. I've got two questions. I'll follow up with that one. If you're not going to respond to, as an offender, if you're not going to respond to any particular type of sentence, what is there that we can do? Do we just have to accept that there are people who will continually commit crime, and we don't necessarily send them to prison because obviously the population issues and everything else? I mean, what would be the adequate response to that person who simply can't change?
I think that more can be done to look at, because people do change, even the ones who've committed 10 or more offences. Most of them stop, and most of them do grow out of it, and they just grow out of it later and later. So there are quite a large number who maybe at 16, 17, 18 think it's fun to do a bit of crime, but stop, get a bigger, I think that stake in conformity, this sort of classic criminological ideas are still valid here. And it's working out what changes. But if you're released from prison and you're back into the same same life, then it would really be astonishing if you did stop.
Yeah.
You're asking a lot of somebody to say, you've just spent 6 unpleasant months in a prison. Reflect on that, and when you're thinking about going out, thieving, think, I might get caught and I might be convicted and I might end up back in that unpleasant place. It's nonsense, really, if you think of it in that way.
Yeah. Gavin, in terms of Scotland and the removal of short prison sentences, what was the sort of political reaction to that suggestion, and was there any sort of public pushback on that idea?
Well, certainly the political reaction was very contentious. The Scottish National Party were in a position at the time where they were working with a big majority and they could take fairly brave policy decisions. The picture was very, very similar to England and Wales in terms of high rates of recidivism, in terms of proportionate use of imprisonment as a sanction. England, Wales and Scotland remain very similar per head of population in terms of the number of people that we send to prison. And certainly opposition parties did oppose the suggestion, as of course did sentencers. Some of them said that what you needed every tool in the armory, if you like. If you've got people coming before the courts, you don't want to take any option away. Now, I should say that it wasn't an abolition of the short custodial sentence. It was a presumption against. So it could still, in exceptional circumstances, be imposed. In terms of a popular reaction to it, I'm not actually aware of any sort of discussion of it, really. There would have been, because one of the things in Scotland is because it's a smaller country, certainly the media pick up on things like this far more quickly. So I will pass on that one. I suppose the one thing I will say is, in terms of significantly reducing the prison population, it's not done that.
Okay.
And I think there's evidence for certainly what Tim was talking about, that some individuals who might have got 8 months suddenly find themselves getting 14 months.
Okay. Thank you. I just have one final question for you both, really, concerning the book. What would be, in the sort of a short sentence, what would be the take-home message from your book?
Okay. I suppose my take-home message would actually draw not on the bits I really did, but on a bit Tim did. And that is, perhaps we just expect too much from the criminal justice process. If we've got significant evidence that there's no such thing as objective truth, or that different parties in a criminal dispute may all be acting in the best of faith, but may well not remember what's happened properly, or may misrepresent incidents, that maybe we should recognize this, and that maybe what we should do is recognize that this not just explains why we sometimes result in miscarriages of justice, but should make us perhaps pause, reflect about whether the criminal trial can do what by its own terms it sets out to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree certainly with that final point, that it's from my point of view, the take home would be to reflect on what it is that we want the criminal justice system to do, and also to sort of reflect on the idea that there isn't criminal justice and the criminal trial focuses very much on a sort of very narrow view of a single truth. Whereas, I think things are much more messy than that, and that, there may be a sort of ultimately some sort of objective truth, but it's filled up with all sorts of stuff that's in there. And one of the problems with criminal justice is that it's acting as a filter all the time. So it's not including that. It's narrowing it down and saying, this is the final question is, did you punch him or not? Well, you know, actually, yeah, I did punch him, but there's a whole backstory to what happened. And I can't honestly remember whether I actually punched him or I kicked him in the head or I, you know, slapped him or I forgot I'd got a glass in my hand, or, you know, all those sorts of varieties. It's presented, you know, at the end, convicted of, you know, Section 18 or whatever, guilty and process. It's a bit of a sort of a conveyor belt system, really, I think. And that's, you know, for me, that's the big problem.
Mm.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was very interesting. And what I've read of the book so far, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it raises some very, very thought-provoking questions. So I want to thank you for your time this morning to discuss the book. Thank you.
That's been my pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Tim and Gavin for giving up their time today to talk to me. I thought it was a really interesting chat, and the book is extremely interesting. You can buy it from Bristol University Press as well as other booksellers. Please do check it out. It's a really thought-provoking book. As well as thanking Gavin and Tim for giving up their time, I'd like to thank the show's supporters whose donations help keep us going. I'd like to thank Joe Doherty, Donna Jenkins, Lucy Green, Claire Malone, Ian Robbins, Elise Goff, Michael Saw, Pad Ryan, and Wolf Ryan. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, I will see you very soon.